Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
So the kind of cool thing was, as soon as we met up with our guide in the parking lot of, the North Cascades National Park, I guess it's the visitor center, right? Marble Mount Visitor Center to pick up our permit. Wilderness Information Center, which honestly, I felt like we'd been to so many times before because that would have actually been the fourth year in a row, I think. 2020, 2021, 2022. Oh, we didn't go to Marble Mount. We went to Glacier. Sad. So it broke a 4-year streak, but whatever. It's our own fault. Anyway, so it was kind of fun being there because I felt so comfortable there already. Like it made me feel a little bit less uneasy, although also kind of stressed. We got there before our guide because luckily he got held up by a little bit of road construction, which was nice because we'd gotten held up by the same road construction. And then I was like, great, we're going to be late. I feel like I was like a school kid again being like, what if my teacher thinks I'm tardy? But it was kind of crazy because he parked his car at a different spot because he was like, well, there's no point in really bringing 2 cars to the trailhead at a trailhead that's traditionally pretty small. It can only hold maybe like 10 cars total. And that way he was like, we can spend time in the car learning stuff. And it was kind of amazing to me. I had no context for what a course would be like, especially one where you like learn a lot. And it was like, as soon as he got into the car, it was like, boom, time to start teaching us. And so kind of on the drive there, he talked a lot about different things that I hadn't really thought of. One thing that really sticks out in my mind is he kind of went over how when you shift from, things like backpacking to mountaineering, you should also be making a shift in your mind from like, what risk tolerance you have to what risk acceptance you have. And I thought that was really interesting because I think, a lot of the time it's like, well, I've got a really good risk tolerance, blah, 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 blah. Or they don't have a very high risk tolerance. But in mountaineering, rather than thinking about it as like, oh, well, they're not like really willing to tolerate too much risk. It's like, no, you need to just say, actually, there is risk inherent. And I am like, what level am I willing to accept? And it's like, I feel like there's not really any shame associated to me in that terminology, because it's like, it's just saying what level are you able to accept versus what, how tolerant are you of risk? Because it sounds cool to have a high risk tolerance, doesn't it? Yeah. But to have a high risk acceptance, it's like, well, that's kind of maybe foolish. And so I feel like he talked a lot about different mindset things that we'd have to be aware of, and like just so many different little aspects as well. He was like, there's 3 main things you have to think about when you're on the mountain.
And he let us like guess, like, well, what would you be thinking about? And we're like, well, like we don't want to like fall off of the mountain. He's like, yes, so falling off the mountain. And then we're like, well, we also don't want to fall like into a crevasse. And he said, yes. So that's like number 2, like not falling into the mountain. And then we thought about rockfall danger as well. And he's like, yep, you don't want the mountain to fall on you. So those are kind of 3 angles that you would think of to assess the current present risk and then protect against it using the tools that you have and the skills that you have. And I remember Carrie and I, we got all 3 of those risk like things that we're being aware of. And I like my little, the student in me that likes to be right. Like I remember feeling proud of myself. Like we're smart girls. We're doing this.
Probably was a good minor confidence boost after we'd spiraled the day before. Yeah. And go ahead.
But I was just going to say, so, I mean, I think the drive from the Wilderness Information Center to the trailhead was almost an hour. And I would say we talked, and specifically interactive learning, where it was question and answer, asking us like what we know about a certain topic and then filling in the blanks and then building off of that the entire time, which like just talking about value, it was incredible how much value we were getting for that.
Yeah, I would say that was something that I thought was really cool. Again, because this course is expensive. No more expensive, I'd say, than other courses, but it's expensive to take a mountaineering course. The amount of value we got out of this was unbelievable. Like I said, from minute 1, we were learning, and like throughout the course, 3 days, I feel like he did not stop teaching from like the second we were out of bed until the second we were all sleeping. Like it was just all a teaching opportunity and about so many things more than just mountaineering, which was just really cool. So we got to the trailhead and we had to park the car, which of course, like the only parking spot, quote unquote, is like the edge of a cliff. And he, was very serious about like, you need to make because people aren't always aware of this, but this is really important for hikers, backpackers, anyone. When you park on a Forest Service road, on a gravel road, you need to make sure that you're parking far enough away from other cars that an ambulance could get through if they needed to. And I'm like, of course, duh. You know, I feel like people don't think about that all the time. They're like, oh, a little spot I can squeeze in and other cars can still just barely make it past. But it's like, how horrible would you feel if someone needed, you know, an ambulance and the ambulance literally can't get through because your car was parked blocking the way? So we had to park and repark and repark and repark until finally it was both safely on the cliff and there was a wide enough area for other cars to come through. So once we parked, we kind of gathered the rest of our gear together and then it was off to the races, which is interesting for us. So you know that we like to go fast. Like we're not runners, but we like to backpack quickly, you know? So we did the John Muir Trail 4 or 5 days faster than we thought we would, because we kind of like to push our bodies. And if we're feeling good, we're not really like, oh, I need to sit around camp for 6 hours type of people. It's fun to sit around camp, but we also like to just do long days because it's somehow enjoyable to us, which sounds insane. So we started out walking, and he was walking. Honestly, it wasn't that slow, but it was interesting because he would talk about how important it is when you're a mountaineer to conserve energy. Like everything you do is about conserving energy because you've got these big objectives. So,
and thinking about how like the approach hike on the mountaineering trail would be like the end result of what you're doing with a typical hike. But with mountaineering, this hike that you're doing is just getting you to another type of terrain, which is then going to apply more skills, and you're going to continue to push your body until you've reached the summit and then turned around and then safely ascended until you're back. So it's like, it's interesting, that concept of like, we're not trying to power through this, say, 4 miles of trail as quick as we can and, you know, get really sweaty and hot and tired so we get there fast. No, we're trying to conserve our energy because once we get to the end of this trail, we're going to start another process that's going to require a lot of mental and physical energy and acuteness just to know like what to keep a good head on your shoulders. So we talked a little bit about pacing, and then we even just talked about like muscle groups that you can use. So a lot of,
because you're carrying such a heavy pack.
And also, we talked about like your calf muscle, right? It's important. Your soleus, your calf are important to propel you forward when you're walking. However, in mountaineering, we think about, well, what's a larger muscle that can help you move forward in that terrain? It's your quadriceps on the front of the thigh. So we even talked about mountaineering steps and how we can focus on, instead of just always pushing off from the foot, we can actually use how we move our knees to use large muscle groups that have more endurance maybe than smaller ones. So it was just interesting because as we were moving through the mountainous terrain, and we're on a trail right now in the forest, we're still learning about these techniques that we can apply. And then Carrie and I, we apply them not only to mountaineering, but we apply them to when we're hiking and we're backpacking and we're in like, you know, doing steep terrain or we need certain endurance types. We can use those muscles and those strategies.
Yeah. So again, it was just one of those things where I don't think I've put that much information into my brain in years. You know, it's like I also have been out of school for 6 years. So it's like, of course you add to things you already know, but you really are building on this foundation that you have massively prepared over years of school and training and work and experience. And then here I am, it's like, I can't even walk in the forest without learning something new. And so it was really an amazing time to learn something new. And kind of as we were making our way up, it was interesting because we had these other climbers who were heading down and they were kind of like, whoa, man, like, just so you guys know, you got to watch out because there's a grizzly bear up ahead in the basement. And our guide was kind of like, okay, you guys like really need to be a little more responsible about the term that you're throwing around because grizzly bears in the North Cascades are not common to see. And so he was like, they could shut down this whole area of the park if you see a grizzly because, you know, they really would have to probably rethink, you know, the way that humans are interacting there because honestly, most people don't really care bear spray in the Cascades that much. It's mostly black bears. And, I think that's kind of just a level of risk acceptance or tolerance that some people have is they don't really carry bear spray because the bears are so easy to scare away typically. Not so in other areas, but especially in the North Cascades. And so that was kind of an interesting thing where there was like suddenly this little weird other anxiety that's being added to our trip, where he looked at the photo they had taken of the bear, and because it was so large and so light in color and shaggy, and they hadn't really gotten a good angle of like the face or if there was a hump or anything, he was like, I actually can't tell if this is a grizzly bear. And so he was like, well, we're just going to keep going because I really don't think the likelihood is that it's a grizzly bear, but like we need to just also be aware, be making a little more noise. Like we can't really get lazy about our food, which we shouldn't anyway. But I think he was kind of like, we need to be a lot more responsible about making noise as we move as well.
And then we got a couple, I don't know, maybe a half mile down the trail, and there's another group of people, and they're like, just so you know, there's a wasp nest coming up, and so make sure you're moving quickly. And so then, we like sped through this next section of trail and never saw any wasps at all. But I feel like there were these just different levels of, like you feel like personally, I knew I was doing something that was inherently had a little bit more risk. And so then you're adding these other layers of risk, like potentially a grizzly bear is there and wasps. And so it was kind of an interesting hike up to our base camp just because of the very random threats that were popping up.
Yeah. But fortunately, we did not see any, massive hive of bees. And we also did not ever see a grizzly bear. We actually talked to a ranger later, and he said he'd seen the same picture. But because he knows the bears of the basin, he said that there actually was a very blonde sow that mated with a very large grizzly the year before. Grizzly. With a very large black bear the year before. And so he was very confident that that was their offspring, which was nice because that way we didn't have to keep thinking about whether or not there was going to randomly be a grizzly bear in the morning.
We made it out of the forest and entered the Boston Basin, which is another just absolutely breathtaking area of the North Cascades National Park, like basically every area that I've been to the North Cascades. And we ventured across a stream and then found kind of like the, specific like tent site area for people with permits to camp in the Boston Basin. And we started to, basically we had to find where we wanted to pitch our tent. And so the North Cascades, among many other places in Washington, can have wonderful biting flies after the mosquito season is over. So we were dealing with biting flies, and so we wanted to find a spot where there was a little bit more of a breeze so we could actually be out of our tents and like learning and engaging in, actually learning in our course without being eaten alive. So it took us a little while to find a good spot to pitch our tents. And then Carrie and I used a new tent from the guiding company, which was more of like a kind of like a ski mountaineering tent, a little bit more durable than the trusty Nemo Hornet. So we learned to set that up, and then we actually used rocks to anchor our tent instead of, pitching a tent with stakes, which is a skill that we didn't have before that. And it's an applicable skill if you're traveling above tree line or if you're camping in rocky locations. So it was interesting because we were already getting kind of this concept of building anchors and equalizing anchors as we were just putting up our tent. So our tent is applicable to mountaineering because you use one on longer trips, but we were also learning skills that were applicable to other parts of mountaineering while we were doing that.
And it was kind of fun because he'd be like, what knot that you learned can you think of that you could use to like attach this rope to this rock? And we could be like, what about this one? And so I think that was actually, I would say, one of those things where, I think that we had this discussion, as people who are climbing partners right now of, is it worthwhile to take this course if we decide we never want to climb again? And it kind of, it was in that we learned so many different aspects that didn't even specifically only relate to mountaineering, but that would apply to other things in our backpacking experiences as well. And so once we had our camp all set up, our tents all set up, he kind of went over some things we needed to know for the next day. Like, I feel like he showed us kind of, like how to put on your crampons or something like that. And we went over knots for quite a while, but it was very interesting because I think we're, overachievers maybe a little bit, but if someone emails me knots and says you need to learn these knots for our course, I'm like, I got to drop everything and make sure that I learn these knots for their course because that's what they said to do. But it was interesting because he was saying a lot of people kind of will come and not have learned their knots for the course. And then you have to spend a major chunk of time trying to teach knots, which I was glad that no one had to see me trying to learn knots except for Molly, because it's humbling to say the least. And so it was really, he was like so psyched that we knew how to do our knots, because he was like, now we can actually spend this time, rather than me saying like, now you hold the rope here and you make it go around like this. Rather than spending a huge chunk of time on that, we could just go straight into other higher level, quote unquote, skills than just tying knots. So that's one thing that I'd say. If you're going to go on a mountaineering trip, a crevasse rescue class, anything like that, if they send you knots, learn them in advance, because even if you're going to go over them in the course again, anytime you can be more efficient on that would be time that you have banked to apply to other things. And so we did that. We had dinner together. I feel like we were still just discussing all kinds of things about climbing. My brain was getting quite full.
And Carrie and I had decided to use one of our Huel meals that was left over from the John Muir Trail. And first of all, when the plastic bag that had been in, like when we poured the boiling water into it, we were kind of concerned if the bag was even going to hold up, which it did. And then I don't understand how we did it, but it didn't taste good after a year. And we did eat it all. And I don't know how we did it, but we decided that we would probably be just making our own meals or buying other brands from that point on.
Yeah. And so
we learned what our guide, our mountaineer, would take for his first night. So he literally was like, well, calories are important. So he had a Trader Joe's salad. And I think with the dressing included, it was like 800 calories. And then he had like a baguette. He's like, this is a 1,200 calorie meal right here.
And then he also had a block of cheese that he was like slicing into it. He was like, well, you should be getting like 1,000 calories per meal, and look at me, this salad with this cheese and baguette, that's over 1,000 calories. And
I was kind of inspired, because I realized that I could be doing much more with my like first night's meal than I've ever done. So that was inspirational to see someone eat a salad and a baguette and cheese with dressing on the salad at the top of like for their like meal before a mountain climb.
So after Molly was just drooling over our guide's special dinner of salad in the backcountry, we decided that the start time for our group would be 4 a.m., no later than 4:30. And so we all got into our sleeping bags and prepared for a night of sleep. I don't even remember if I slept or not. I don't know. I think I actually kind of rested pretty well.
Before that, though, we saw like an amazing sunset because there was actually a fire. It was the sourdough fire, I think, burning in another area of the park. So there was this high level of smoke. But then when the sun was setting, it was just like this perfect red and orange color all over the sky. So we enjoyed that sunset. And then, like Carrie said, we got in our tents and kind of got ready to get as much rest as we possibly could before we had an early start. And, climbing our first glaciated peak, Sahalee Peak.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. If you'd like to see any photos or videos from what we talked about today, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures. And if you like what you've heard ever, you can always leave us a rating or review so that other people can find our podcast as well. Thanks so much.
Bye.